I want to turn to updates from our two-member working groups, one which is focused on deliberation, and the other is focused on bioethics education. And these working groups have undertaken preparatory work for the Bioethics Commission, reviewing our past work and identifying gaps and areas for improvement in these fields. So we're going to start off with an update from the Deliberation Working Group, and every member of our commission is in one or the other of these groups, and I'm going to ask Nelson to report out on that.
Thanks, Amy. So I'm going to summarize a discussion that happened by teleconference on the 9th of July of this year for the Deliberation Working Group. This group consists of myself, Anita Allen, Dan Solmese, Christine Grady, Amy Gutman, and Jim Wagner. We sought to review the Commission's past work on deliberation, discuss our thoughts on the topic, formulate potential recommendations to propose to the full Commission, and to identify any remaining gaps that require further research or expert presentations. So first, our discussion. We discussed what we have already learned about the deliberative process from experts, one of whom chairs our Commission, and from our own experience. We agreed that in our report it will be our responsibility to first describe deliberation, the principles that underlie it, and what circumstances it can be valuable. For example, we should explain that respect for differing opinions is one of the tenets of deliberation and sets it apart from most contemporary political discussions. We also agreed that in the report we should explain, using vivid examples, how the Commission itself has engaged in and encouraged deliberation. For example, we can detail some of the problems we tackled that presented competing values, describe how we worked through these competing values to reach consensus, and as in our report on whole genome sequencing, reconciling the benefits of widespread data sharing of genetic data with the risks of such practices. However, we agreed that we should also acknowledge the limitations and challenges that our body faced in deliberating. Finally, the group felt strongly that the report should provide a reasoned argument in favor of deliberation as compared to other methods of policy making, and should also emphasize the value of deliberation to enhance bioethics education. So in terms of potential recommendations, we came up with two potential ideas that we thought were ripe for recommendations. And I should just emphasize that we are not post-decisional on that at this point. First, we agree that the Commission should firmly state that the deliberative processes should be incorporated into policy decisions, especially difficult and polarizing ones. However, we emphasize that we must be as specific as possible in formulating this recommendation, perhaps by pointing out specific methods for incorporating deliberation, such as increasing face-to-face interactions, leveraging social media for deliberation rather than polarization and name-calling, and improving fact-check mechanisms so that participants do not waste time debating established facts. Second, we agreed that we should recommend the collection of evidence about whether, how, and in which context deliberation can work. These studies should be comparative, assessing existing methods for reaching policy solutions against deliberation. The results of these studies will help and strengthen the argument that deliberation is a valuable tool. So in terms of points for continued discussion, one aspect for which we need more guidance is on the appropriate research to recommend for studying deliberation. Metrics to use for determining its value would be quite critical. For example, deliberative polling is a more involved and potentially more costly version of deliberation. To advise about situations in which strategies like deliberative polling add the most value, we need to study it. But how should we go about doing that? So we welcome discussion with the rest of the Commission about this topic and thoughts on our proposed recommendation and brainstorming next steps.
I'm going to ask, what do you think? Should we take discussion of this, or should we go on to the education and then let's go on to the education. Let me just make an executive decision. Let's ask Nita, who's on the phone, to report out for the education working group, and then Steve, and then we'll open it up before we go on to our panels. So Nita, you're on.
Thank you, Amy.
And we can hear you loud and clear, so that's great.
Terrific. I'm glad to hear that. So I'm going to report about the considerations of the Bioethics Education Working Group, or the Ethics Education Working Group, where we had a teleconference on July 9th and met together with other commission members, Barbara Atkinson, Steve Hauser, Raju Kushal Pati and myself, as well as with the guidance of our Bioethics Commission staff. And we took up the question of how educational activities of all sorts can really encourage serious engagement for the process of democratic deliberation in society with our individual and our collective values. And we were really focusing on how the contributions of ethics education could help produce informed citizens, thoughtful professionals, empowered health consumers, and at what stage of the educational process we might start that kind of education and training. And particularly given that what we're talking about is a very multidisciplinary field, so science, medicine, bioethics, biomedical research, ethics education really needs to be available across a wide variety of disciplines. So this shouldn't just be something that's paired with science education or medicine, but across the board. We looked at a number of issues and some points that we think would help to have ongoing commitment to this topic. And in particular, we looked at several targeted recommendations, and I'm going to start with the first one, and then Steve Hauser is going to take the task of talking through some of the other things we focused on. So the first one that we focused on, and an area that I think is really important, is on the specific levels of education. And we had a very rich conversation about how it's really too late to wait to introduce ethics education at the graduate level or as part of the professional training experiences, that the best thing we could do is to push that kind of education much earlier into the educational setting. So as early and even earlier than high school, ethics education could help to prepare all members of society to really become broad thinkers, to engage with complex problems, to have the tools for being able to think through the issues that we're faced as a society, whether in our personal lives or in our professional lives. After high school education, we think that undergraduate education could really build on this early foundation. So in particular, we think this shouldn't be something that's just paired again with science education, but something that really should be a core part, even a mandated part of curricular requirements as a first step toward providing greater ethics literacy and ethics competency. And Steve will get to some of the specifics that we think are essential that could be built into this kind of early education model. And then finally, graduate, professional, and continuing education should be expanded to address ethics and professionalism, and in this instance, tailored more specifically to the challenges that these different professional or graduate students are likely to encounter in their career. So basically starting with a much broader kind of focus and then narrowing to the specific types of competency that will be relevant to the level of education over time. So I'll now hand things over to Steve Hauser to describe the rest of the working group process.
Thank you, Nita. Steve.
Thanks, Nita. Our second major area of focus was considering how we educate the next generation of bioethicists, and possible recommendations include, first, to identify core competencies, not with the aim of providing an exhaustive list, but rather just to highlight central ethical skills such as risk literacy, critical reasoning, and et cetera. Second, we think that it will be useful to describe the strengths of experiential approaches that link ethical reasoning to real-world applications, and case studies are particularly useful in this regard. The third area that we considered for potential recommendations in our report concerned how to evaluate the success of ethics education. Methods of assessment might achieve several aims, including first, identifying real education successes in classroom teaching methods. Second, by documenting achievement of course outcomes. And third, by examining the consistency in a discipline or profession by surveying the curricular requirements of programs or universities. This afternoon, a panel of speakers will help flesh these issues out and address the topic of fostering and measuring success during session 4 today. Finally, our working group felt strongly that the coming report should actively illustrate ethics education and its practical value. For example, we might employ a compelling contemporary example to demonstrate the value and importance of improving ethics education. So that, I think, concludes our report, Nita. I might ask Raju, Barbara, or Amy if things have been left out that they would like to add.
Raju?
That's actually quite good, but I do want to make a comment if that, okay. Right. So I think I think when we think about presenting this report, we should be thinking about, I think, two aspects. One is what we think would be an ideal solution to the problem and what are the kinds of recommendations it would make. But it's also important for us to understand the practical implications of implementing any of the recommendations that we make. And the recommendations should not be such that it's impossible for many other organizations to implement them. So we should provide specific examples as to how we could implement it. And the implementation of many of the recommendations may be gradual. Mm-hmm. It may not happen all tomorrow. But if we could provide a framework in which the people can think about that nationally and how they can implement that and at what stage of education, I think that would be beneficial.
Barbara? So one of the reasons it's important to give examples is precisely for what Raju says. If we give examples of what we see as excellent deliberation in action and excellent ethics education in action, that shows, rather than just tells, that it is possible to do this. Now, we want to recommend more, so what Raju is saying, I think, is very important. It should be, we should and we will take into account what we think is actually practically possible. And so I think that's a really good point. Christine, do you have something you would like to add? I also, let me just say, I invite any questions right now. We're going to, our next session begins at 9:45. We may even begin it early, but if there are any questions now, right now for the working groups, just bring them up to me. And I see Michelle's sitting right there, and she has cards. So we want to make this easy. So there are cards all around. It's just easier if I read them for the public record from up here. So Christine.
So I'm just glad to see that both groups realized that we need more information or evidence about methods and outcomes, both in terms of deliberation and education. And as we're expanding, you're recommending expanding education to all levels, I find it hard to think that anyone would disagree that that's a good idea, but how to do it is the really tricky thing. And so implementation is really important, but also knowing what methods work is really important. And we're going to have to say something about how do we get, there is some evidence out there, and that's the very important thing, but there could be more.
Yeah, let me just address that with both agreeing, but also an important detail or caveat. So we should draw upon the literature that exists based on some really good studies of I'll just focus on deliberation right now. There's deliberation in education. We got, Diana Hess gave some very good testimony to this commission based on really excellent research that's done in the best way of social science research of what works, and it had qualifications of when deliberation is difficult and how you overcome those difficulties. We should draw on that. We also should, and here's my caveat, we now know that the alternative to deliberation in our society tends to be not taking account of positions that you happen not to like, demeaning your opponents, denying facts when they're well-established scientific facts. We have to be, so the caveat is we have to be careful that we recommend what we know on the face of it is better than that, given that there isn't research. The reason that's happening in our society isn't because there's a body of research saying it's the best way to do it. It's the easiest thing to do given the cultural and political climate we live in. So we ought not to hesitate in strongly recommending more deliberation until there's more research on the refinements of it, given that the alternative is the status quo, which has nothing scientifically or ethically to be said for it other than that it's the status quo. So I think it's really important that we strongly recommend what we know on the basis of the best evidence and the best ethics to be better than the status quo, and also recommend that more research be done to refine the methods and to know among all the ways you can deliberate what are the best ways. Is that a friendly,
Absolutely.
friendly amendment?
I want to say I agree with both. I think capitalizing on the best evidence that exists already, and I agree with you that Diana Hess's examples were wonderful, and the research that she's done, for example, is wonderful. But there's nothing worse than telling people to do deliberation or education and have them do it wrong. And then you get, people who think ethics is not a good thing, and so I think we need to capitalize on the evidence that does exist, and also recognize that there is room for more evidence.
Great. So now I have some questions, which...
And Amy, sorry to just chime in. When you have a moment, I'd like to add after your question.
Sure. So let me take some questions. Really, John Gastill, Penn State. John, welcome. If the commission had to prioritize either influence on policymakers, I love these kinds of questions because they're very... If the commission had to prioritize either influence on policymakers or embracing the broader public's ethical deliberation, which would be the more important objective for its work and its report? Enhancing, excuse me. Either influence on policymaking, or enhancing the broader public's ethical deliberation, which would be the more important objective for its work and its report?
Both.
Let me, I'm going to bite I will bite the bullet at the risk of my commission members, which I'd be happy if they, I actually think enhancing the public's ethical deliberation does more than, firstly, I'm taking, Raju, firstly, I want to take into account what's possible. I think direct influence on elected policymakers in our environment is very, very difficult. I think indirect influence by enhancing the public the public who's attentive public. It's not, we're not under any, illusion that we get as many people paying attention to us as some unnamed candidates in the primaries do. However, if we can enhance public deliberation, we have an influence on policymakers. Now, the reason we all will say that we don't have to choose is that each one of the examples we gave earlier enhanced public deliberation, no doubt, and it also influenced policymakers who were attentive to being influenced, and I think we can do both. But if I had to choose, I would choose the public. Raju.
I think I could give a specific example that actually illustrates the point that you are trying to make.
Right.
I think that certainly one of the areas that I'm involved in is teaching graduate students ethics. And many institutions, many years ago, recognized the importance of teaching students the deliberative process and the ethical principles of research. And at that time, the policymakers were not really aware of the necessity for doing that, but they later took the lead from these several academic institutions. And now, for example, the National Institutes of Health makes it mandatory that all of the institutions that receive support from the NIH in training grants should educate the students in ethical conduct of research. So those are the two steps that happened. The broader goal is to be able to educate all of those people, scientists, emerging scientists. And as a result of that, we were able to influence the policymakers, and the policymakers then came forward, and now it is essentially, as a result of that, it's mandatory for everybody.
That's terrific. I'm going to go on to one other question because I will stay on time. We will not go past 9:45. These things will come up again. So Karen Maher. Karen, can you pronounce your last name for me?
It's Maher.
I got it. Maher. Great. Karen, raise your hand here. Is a staff member at the Bioethics Commission, senior policy and research analyst in philosophy. And I think this question is very timely and is one we need to think about specifically. And again, this is in the spirit of how to make sure our recommendations maximize their capacity to be put into practice. So in a search for accountability for student performance, this is about education, recent education policies have emphasized testing. This has placed pressure on students and public scrutiny on teachers that has often overshadowed their important public mission, their important public service, the importance of, for example, teaching good citizenship and teaching ethics. How does ethics education provide an alternative to these trends? Can we give an answer to that? Anyone? We should think about how we can make it clear. I would say we really should think about how we can make it clear that, I'll give an example, teaching history so that students learn history is not only compatible with, but points you towards engaging students in ethical deliberations and role-playing about how what happened in the Civil War, for example, becomes much more vivid if students are engaged in arguments about slavery. And so I think we need to make clear in our recommendations of secondary school ethics education how this is actually a way of teaching students important subject matters like history better. And I provoked some. Nelson and then Dan.
Well, I would just say quickly, I think it's more important for people to understand, what the dynamics were of something like the Civil War than being able to spout out the exact dates that the Battle of Gettysburg happened and how many people were on each side. I mean, but the latter is something that's easily testable and quantifiable. And the former is something that requires maybe more subjective input, but I think it's more valuable.
Yeah, this leads to a question I had for the subgroup on education to begin with. A related question is that we're sort of emphasizing measuring the outcomes of ethics education, which, and from what I heard from the group, a lot of what you talked about was about competencies and measurable competencies. I think we all know that being able to pass a test in ethics doesn't necessarily make one a good scientist or a good physician, for instance. And so I wondered how much time the working group gave to talking about virtue and education for virtue as part of what we do in bioethics, because I think while it is less easy to characterize, more difficult to teach, more difficult to measure, it may in the end be a more important part of our education. So I don't know if you spoke about it, and if not, I think I would recommend we make it part of the report. So.
Could I weigh in on that, Amy?
Yes, and please, Nita.
So I think that's a great question, Dan. And one of the things that we focus on, so the short answer is yes, we did talk about the role of virtue and that being part of the educational process. One of the things that we think is really important for us to provide some leadership and guidance on is the question of what counts as core competencies, for lack of a better word. How do we think about the set of things that should go into ethics education? Because to Christine and Amy's point earlier, it's really important that we do this well. And part of doing this well is identifying what are the set of things that we think go into doing it well. What are the set of competencies? What are the set of discussions that are necessary to do so? And I echo your sentiment, Dan, that I think virtue education and figuring out how to do that well and how to incorporate that is really essential. And I'll add a second point while I'm speaking, which is part of doing this well is really making sure that this doesn't just become a checkbox, that it is truly applied learning, that it is a way to enable people to both recognize its importance but feel engaged in it rather than feeling like it's just a necessary part of the curriculum. And I think we heard some really great examples of that at our last meeting. One that stood out for me was the ethics lab at Georgetown in the way that they're really coming up with an integrated learning experience, an applied learning experience that gives students the ability to both build the competencies and apply it to real-world problems. And I think being creative and thinking about how to do ethics education well, including through experiential application, will be an important and valuable part of our report.
Terrific. I would just say, and this is picking up on a question that I won't read but will answer, you'll understand the question. In ethics education, there's good evidence that the development of autonomy, the cultivation of character, ethics education, and building skills for learning throughout life, especially at the early stages at the high school level, they all come together in good ethics education. That if you engage students in real, I'll use history again, real historical examples where you have to know the facts. There are actors, you talk about the actual people, citizens and public officials who had to make decisions at the time. You ask students to role play and take positions that they may disagree with, and you get them really engaged and feeling what was at stake. You teach the elements of character, and you teach elements of decision making, and you teach skills of reasoning and argumentation. So we should, in our report, with using bioethics as some example, but we can use other examples earlier on, make that clear. And with that, we're going to continue this discussion in other ways with our really expert and wonderful presenters. I'm going to ask the first panel of the day to come up to our table.